quick intro. Welcome, everybody. Nice that you're joining this webinar. We're going to dive into the supply chain data in China. This is a cooperation between Dubrink and Reset Carbon. We are working together to serve our clients to get the best emissions as possible and to automate CBAM data. My name is Marcel Duits. I am the CEO of Dubrink. We're based in Prague in Europe. And Sam, you can introduce yourself, of course.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Sam Nunn, Principal Consultant at Reset Carbon. We're a Hong Kong-based, Asian-focused decarbonisation consultant. I'll give some more background on Reset in a minute.
Yes, so let's get started.
Good. Do you want me to take over, Marcel? Good. Maybe a couple of housekeeping rules, everybody, to start with. So feel free to ask questions during this webinar. So we've got the Q&A function within Teams there. We are recording the webinar as well. So if anybody wants to catch up afterwards or wants to share this with others at your companies, feel free, and we'll make sure to share this with everybody promptly after the call. Good. Okay, so maybe let's go through the agenda for today's session. So I think the overall context for this is that we see that CBAM is rapidly approaching for people. Yes, we've had the omnibus publications, so maybe there's a little bit more time to get data ready, but it doesn't really change the urgency of what CBAM is. That people are now starting to realize that this is not just something where you can do it as a desktop exercise, but you need to make sure you have a lot of very good data from your supply chain, and that can be challenging. And the idea is that we want to sort of share our experience as Dubrink and Reset on how do you get this data, what do supply chains in China look like, and how can we make this process as streamlined as possible. So hopefully you'll come away from this webinar with an understanding of what Chinese supply chains look like, how you can best get data for your own CBAM reporting, and hopefully some concrete next steps for you to take away and implement. So maybe let me just introduce Reset Carbon quickly. We are a mission-driven decarbonisation consultant. What does that mean? It means that really we exist to support companies in driving meaningful emissions reductions throughout their supply chains. We are Hong Kong based. We've been in business here for around 15 years, and we've actually got offices around the region. So we do a lot of work in mainland China, also in Taiwan and in Southeast Asia, and we've even got team members on the ground in India as well. Our team consists of around 70 people across the region. Basically, they are primarily carbon experts. We have also expertise in waste reduction and water reduction as well, but primarily carbon experts. And our team is a sort of combination of consultants. We spend a lot of time working with corporations on their strategy of how they deal with the emissions in their supply chains, but also engineers who actually go out and visit suppliers on the ground to gather real data and work on implementing decarbonisation activities. So that could be renewable energy installation, it could be energy management system installation, it could be coal phase out or fuel switching. So really anything that's necessary in a production site to reduce the carbon emissions within that site. Our clients mainly consist of sort of two groups, I would say. One is large Asian corporations, and you can see here a few of the big conglomerates in the region we've worked with in the past. But additionally, large international firms, particularly brands who have supply chains in the region. And really that work consists of a lot of the similar stuff to what we do with CBAM, which is about helping people get transparency on their supply chains and figure out how to engage suppliers to reduce emissions. So Reset has kind of expertise in four kind of key areas. We've got a lot of experience in apparel and sort of consumer goods supply chains, both hard and soft goods. A lot of expertise also in real estate, particularly when it comes to things like low carbon steel and concrete procurement. Electronics and IT, semiconductor supply chains, manufacturing supply chains for electronics, and additionally agriculture and food and beverage, particularly sort of how to decarbonize key commodities such as rice, soy, poultry, beef, and the like. So that's a quick introduction to us. Now, maybe we can just do a quick recap to start off with on what is CBAM, right? Why are we talking about this? Well, for those who maybe are totally new to this topic, CBAM means the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And what is this? It's basically a policy that's been enacted under the EU Green Deal, which mandates companies who are purchasing products abroad to also purchase a certificate which is sort of related to the carbon emissions of that imported product, right? So what it basically does is aims to equalize the carbon price that you pay for a product you're manufacturing in the EU compared to a product that you manufacture abroad, right? So, for example, if you're manufacturing steel at the moment in the EU, you will have to pay a certificate, or certificates based on the emissions under the EU emissions trading scheme. But if you were to supply in China, you actually wouldn't need to pay those. So what this aims to do is basically impose an import tax on those products that are manufactured abroad to stop people moving their carbon intensive processes outside of the EU. The idea is that it also sends a strong sort of signal to global manufacturers that they need to think about decarbonizing their operations as well. So historically, the EU has been working a lot on how to decarbonize heavy industry within the EU, but this is the first time that there's really sort of an extraterritorial signal that suppliers, wherever they are, if they want to do business with the EU, they need to think seriously about decarbonizing. So let's maybe set the scene a little bit on actually what is CBAM reporting and what does everybody do? Well, basically there are a couple of sides to CBAM within the EU and also within China. So maybe if we just start on the right-hand side of the screen here. Basically, there are two roles that are played by companies in the EU. The first is the brand, the second is the importer. Right? These could be the same or they could be different. Basically, the importer is the person who is actually the one bringing the products over the border into the EU and filling in the customs declarations, to put it very, very simply. Now, under CBAM, what this person needs to do is collect emissions data from the exporter in China or wherever else outside the EU, and they need to report this emissions data to the EU registry. What they'll also need to do following 2027 is pay a certificate for the emissions reported. Right? So per ton of emissions that you report, you will have to pay an amount for that. Okay, and this amount basically is going to be the difference between the EU carbon price over the last 3 months and the carbon price in whatever country of origin that the goods came from. Now, where it gets complicated is when we get to the exporter side, right? So actually, a lot of the onus for getting the data for CBAM reporting falls on suppliers. So that's either the exporter who is exporting directly from China to the EU. A lot of the time, this is a trader or some kind of sort of assembly company. Now, what this person needs to do is they need to measure and provide emissions data to the import into the EU. And this in itself can be quite challenging, right? You need to really understand within your operations actually what emissions are being produced and come up with a calculation on a product level of your emissions. Where it gets even more complicated is you need to collect data from what are called precursor materials, which means actually all of the raw materials that went into the product, you need to make sure that you have the emissions data from those as well. So, and then there's obviously the suppliers of those precursor materials need to provide you with that emissions data. Now, this is going to be the theme of today's workshop, right? How do we perform these two steps? Because typically where we see that the whole CBAM process breaks down is that EU importers really struggle to get data from their suppliers in China. And suppliers in China, that's not their fault. It's basically that getting this emissions data can be really, really challenging for them. So this is something that we want to start to tackle through the content of today's workshop. As mentioned, please drop questions into the chat box if you've got any questions on these kind of roles and responsibilities, and we can answer the questions as they come up. So let's refresh on actually what data needs to be reported by the exporters from China. So first of all, the data that needs to be reported is what's called embedded emissions. So these are all of the CO2 emissions that are associated with producing a certain CBAM good. Right? So that could be steel, it could be cement, it could be aluminium, it could be hydrogen, and so forth. Now, typically for China, based on what's being exported from China to the EU, typically steel and aluminium are the big ones here. So the first thing that needs to be reported on this is direct carbon emissions, right? So this is CO2 that's directly released by the facility that produces the product, right? So for example, if you're producing a screw and you need to have some kind of milling process to produce that screw, the electricity or any electricity you generate on site, burning coal in a thermal process on site needs to be reported. So this is sort of roughly analogous to Scope 1 emissions. There's also indirect carbon emissions, right? And these are emissions that are from the production of electricity used in manufacturing a product, right? So again, if you've got some kind of electrified machinery in your factory and you're getting power from the grid, you need to cover this. You also need to cover any energy that you produce on your own within the installation. So, if you've got solar panels on the roof or if you've got a cogen plant, this all needs to be covered. And also anything covered under a power purchase agreement, typically not so common for China. It's not that common that companies have these yet. And then finally, there are precursor carbon emissions. So basically, this is if you've got your CBAM product, your screw, this is simply put the emissions that were emitted in producing the steel for that screw, right? So that is whatever emissions went into producing the raw materials that your product is made of. Right? This can be two scenarios. It can be produced in the same facility as the CBAM goods. If you've got some big verticalized manufacturing where you've got your say you're an aluminium smelter and you're importing sort of sheet aluminium into the EU, you may well do everything in the same site, or it can be purchased, right? As I say, if you're sort of somebody making a screw or a nail and you're purchasing rolled steel, then you're going to need to get this precursor data from your suppliers. So, as you can see, it's quite a lot of data. It's quite complicated, and there's a lot to report here, and it can be a lot of layers as well within this. So the question really from this comes, how do you get good data quality? Right? Because not all data is created equal. There's a few risks with CBAM reporting. The main one is that if you actually report emissions data that's too high, you're going to have to pay, right? And the more emissions you report, the more you pay. Obviously, you've got to be honest about your emissions, but at the same time, you don't want to overestimate because it's going to cost you more money. So there's basically three ways that you can estimate your carbon emissions for CBAM. The first is using what's called the EU default values. Now, for every kind of product that is produced and shipped into the EU, that's covered by CBAM, so that could be a screw, it could be rolled aluminium, it could be fertilizer. Every product has what's called a default emissions value, which is given by the EU per kilo of that product or per ton of that product. So basically, the idea is you can use this if you have absolutely nothing else. And actually, the EU is allowing companies, even within the active period of CBAM, to report up to 20% of their emissions using these default values. Now, the big problem with these default values is they are aimed to take the worst case scenario. So typically, the default values are taken from averaging out the emissions that are coming from the absolute worst performing sites for these products in the EU. So, for example, a lot of that is saying if it's steel, this is going to be the dirtiest, sort of most energy-intensive coal-fired steel blast furnaces that are taken in calculating these default values. So typically, they're a massive overestimate. And so if you just use the default values, you're going to be sort of reporting too much when it comes to emissions and probably having to pay too much. Now, once we get into the active period of CBAM, anyway, you can only use default values for 20% of your emissions. So you need to go one level deeper. And here, basically, it's about then getting the real emissions from your tier one supplier. So really the exporter giving you their real emissions from their facility. And then looking at the precursor product quantities. So say if you've got kilos of screws that are made out of steel and putting some kind of local emissions factor on. Right? So you might say, okay, Chinese steel in general has X amount of tons per kilo, and I'm sourcing my steel in China, so I'm going to use this for my precursor materials. Now, this is a bit better but it still doesn't really allow you to have clarity on how carbon intensive your different suppliers are, right? Because you're applying one emissions factor for every supplier. What we recommend is to go deeper than that and really get very high quality data that we call on-site data. Right? So this is really understanding not only the data from your suppliers' facilities, but really going and understanding the precursor suppliers' facility emissions as well, right? So if you've got a steel plant, really understanding, looking at their facility and understanding actually how they're using energy within their facility, and again using emissions factors for the materials that are more localized, right? So really not just saying sort of Chinese steel is going to have this, but saying, okay, steel produced in the Shanghai area based on the specific grid constraints of Shanghai is going to have this much, right? So really, really localizing this data as much as possible. So why might you want to use different levels of CBAM data? Well, let's have a look at the default values first of all. As I said, these are the EU values that are given per product, right? So this could be for a screw, there will be a certain default value. Well, the advantage is it's really simple to implement. You can do this calculation really easily. You know how many tons of screws you're importing per year, and you can attach the default value. Now, the problem with this is it's typically, as I said, a significant overestimate. They assume the worst case scenarios, you'll be overpaying. The other thing is that you really have to, if you want to use these default values for reporting most of your emissions, you really have to demonstrate to the EU that it was not possible for you to get real supplier data, right? So you're also kind of running a risk on whether or not you're going to be compliant if you use these default values for the majority of your emissions. The next thing is sort of the minimum level, right? So to say, okay, I'm going to gather my tier 1 supplier data, and then for the rest of the emissions, I'm going to sort of use sort of defensible assumptions for my emissions factors, right? They might not be perfectly precise, but they're okay. They're sort of a good estimate. Well, the good thing is here, you'll get higher transparency on where your emissions are coming from, on maybe a national level. If you're importing steel from India and China, you might be able to say, okay, I can see that my Indian steel is more carbon intensive than my Chinese steel. And you're also sort of demonstrating some effort to the customs authority that you're really, you're at least breaking this down on a national level and going a bit deeper. Problem is that you still can't really adjust your sourcing strategy based on this, right? So if you, for example, are sourcing 50% of your steel in China from 3 suppliers and you're sourcing the other from India with 3 suppliers, you don't know which of these suppliers are the most intensive because you're still just using a national emissions factor. It makes it very difficult for you to actually make decisions on supplier strategy to reduce your certificate payment and ultimately your emissions because you don't really have the sort of local specific data. And the final thing you can do then is the high quality on-site data. So what are we looking for here? Basically looking at kind of real supplier data for both the product and the precursor manufacturer, right? So what this does, the advantages is it gives you real transparency on which of your suppliers are carbon intensive. It allows you to choose your suppliers based on their carbon emissions, or also to negotiate with your suppliers that, maybe if they're causing you too much of a cost because of CBAM certificates, you can use this in your negotiations over the rates you're going to pay for the product. The other thing is you can make interventions with your suppliers to reduce emissions. So if you see that you've got, for example, an extrusion plant that is using very, very old-fashioned coal-fired heat for using the machines, you might actually be able to make an intervention with that supplier to electrify that process so that you can turn it to renewable energy. I mean, that's just a very tangible example. And that overall is going to, again, reduce your CBAM certificate payment. The challenge here is it's workload intensive and it requires you to have a real local interface to your suppliers, right? You might say, okay, why not do this? It makes sense, but you need to make sure that you can actually interact with all of your different suppliers. So overall, as reset, what do we recommend? I mean, we've got a lot of experience of working with suppliers here. Overall, for us, we still recommend trying to get as much on-site data as possible. Basically, there are 3 reasons for this. The first is it allows you to get transparency into the emissions contribution of each of your suppliers, and you can make educated decisions on your strategy for sourcing based on then the CBAM fees it's going to lead you to pay. You can optimize your costs through supplier selection. You may want to say that actually when the CBAM certificate payments come into force, and also as the carbon price gradually goes up every year, you phase out carbon intensive suppliers. You may also want to use this as a way to encourage your suppliers to decarbonize, because you can really say to them, look, your price is going to go up, and so I'm going to reduce the reduce the payment or reduce the amount I buy from you in the future if you don't decarbonize. And then finally, and I think this is also important, there's a lot of uncertainty in CBAM at the moment on actually being able to understand what the customs authorities are really looking at when they come to say, what's good quality, and what's a lot of effort of having gone to in your CBAM reporting. If you can show that you've gone right down to the level of your different suppliers, it can be really, really useful for you to sort of demonstrate to the customs authorities that you're really taking this topic seriously and avoid any fines based on non-compliance. So I see we had a question in the chat, so maybe I will just answer this one now. Yeah, so basically the question is it possible to submit the CBAM report for 2024 using default values? Well, look, I mean, I think to be honest, the information is in the question here to a certain extent, right? The EU is really sort of phasing out default values, and really the idea is that for even 2024, you should be using as much real data as you can. Now, I think basically the EU has still recommended that this year, if you cannot get real emissions data, then you can still use the default values. But I think you need to also just admit there that this is something that is really up to their interpretation of whether you've gone to enough effort. So I think a lot of the EU reporting or sort of the communication so far say you need to have demonstrated that you have tried to get real data from your suppliers and that you've made a real effort there, and if not, then there is still a liability for a fine. And actually, I think even under the sort of new ruling with Omnibus, that's actually going to be even more severe. So I think really they're saying that there is a bit of a delay here in terms of the active period of CBAM, but you do definitely still need to have gone to try to get as much data as you can out of your supply chain. I don't know, Marcel, if you've got any perspective on this question as well in the chat box.
I hear this question very often, and I completely understand why people actually prefer to still work with default values, because it makes life much easier. On the other hand, I visit a lot of trade shows, as you know, Sam, and I come across a lot of steel importers. And just last week, I spoke with one steel importer importing 100,000 tons of steel with a certain emission factor on it. And a quick calculation showed that they will have to pay over 4 million euros of emission certificates next year. Now, if they would not have their actual data, that would most likely, and this is based on assumptions because not all the details are known yet, but most likely they will have to pay with default values 8 million euros. You can imagine that that's a big difference. So, I totally understand that usually people prefer default values. It's very hard to get them. We want to know if we now can still report with them. Yes, people do that because they don't have all the actual data yet. The question is, what is your client going to do in the EU if you're a factory and by 2026 you don't have your data ready? That's why I see, for example, a lot of our clients in the Dubrink platform looking and scanning for factories in our platform who is already there and who can provide actual data, because that makes them an interesting target to order your steel, aluminium, and materials from in 2026 as an alternative to the suppliers, which currently now say, sorry guys, it's only going to be default values.
Yeah, I think this probably leads us really well actually onto the next section, right, which is understanding really the complexity of getting this data, right? And it is true, it's something that's extremely difficult for a lot of people to get the right kind of CBAM data. I think we'll explore a little bit why this is in the next section, and kind of why these questions about using default values keep coming up. So I want to sort of just show this, which is an example actually of a customer that we work with in Denmark. They make kind of actually garage doors is their main product, right? So I think I want to show this one because I think it really shows this is a product that looks fairly simple, right? It's a big aluminium sheet, and you know, you maybe have some pulleys and some locking mechanisms, but ultimately it's a fairly simple product. Now, the importer based in Denmark had one supplier in China who was their kind of go-to person. They're a trading company. Now, this supplier, you know, supplied basically they would assemble about 18 different components to each garage door, right? So there was the main door body, there was some springs, there were some locks, you know, there was some struts and other components to fit everything together. Now, a lot of these were semi-finished goods, right? So, for example, let's take the locking mechanism, right? It's a semi-finished good. When we actually looked at all of the precursor material suppliers that they had across these 18 suppliers, there were over 100 precursor material suppliers. Right? Now, what this basically shows is that for their one supplier to actually get the clarity from all of their 18 factories on the emissions was already quite hard. To have each of these 18 factories then go and gather emissions on precursor materials was even more difficult, especially when you see that most of them were going back to the same two state-owned steel and aluminium suppliers. Right? Now, why is this complicated? Well, first of all, we see that carbon literacy really starts to break down after you get to factory level. Really, a lot of suppliers in China have very little clarity on even what carbon emissions are, let alone why they're supposed to be reporting them. They don't know how to make these calculations. They don't know how to gather this data. A lot of them, you know, we get the question of, well, it's easy. They've got an energy meter on each piece of equipment or something like that. Can't they just give us their energy data from their equipment? Quite frankly, a lot of suppliers, you know, these factories are so small that they're not even gathering data on energy usage, apart from just they sort of pay their energy bill at the end of every month. So they're really not mature in this respect of managing sort of data and energy. So it can be very difficult for them. And then obviously once you get down to the precursor material suppliers, it can be even more complicated. And finally, we see sort of these state-owned steel and aluminium suppliers. They're just such giant organizations, and they're getting hundreds and hundreds of these requests now. They are not going to answer every single request individually. So what we have here is really a dynamic where you have one supplier who is somehow responsible for gathering all of this data from a very, very complex, a complex supply chain. And this can be a real challenge for them. You know, we see that sort of the different scale of the companies is a real challenge here. So if you look at the supplier, you know, often they're sort of a trading company. They're sourcing a certain category of goods, right? So, you know, I pulled a photo from a trade show here. This is a company who sources cleaning tools, but as I said, our previous example, they were a sourcer of garage doors. They probably only work in one category. They're often a small business. You know, a lot of the time, these are sort of just five to 10 employees, these trading companies, and really they're just sort of buying and selling. They're not really kind of getting a window into the production process. They often have very little visibility on the factories that they're actually sourcing from. You then have kind of the installations, right? And here, you know, you have people manufacturing components of sort of varying complexity. You know, maybe they are a final assembler, but they could also be just sort of supplying semi-finished goods. Again, they're often very small businesses. They are often, as you can see here, quite simple factories, right? So I don't know exactly what this is producing. I think this is a screw factory or a nail factory from what I remember. But basically, you can see here, all that this factory does is it is a bank of kind of extrusion machines all lined up. There's wire going into those, and that's it. That's all they do. They manufacture this kind of one thing. They may have very standardized products. They may be shipping to hundreds and hundreds of different suppliers, these trading companies. So again, for them to sort of be able to spend their time on individual requests for data is often quite challenging. They often don't have the expertise. They often don't have the bandwidth to be able to do it. And they often really don't see the business case. And then what you have are kind of finally these state-owned giant companies. You know, maybe they are supplying, say, rolled steel or aluminium to the precursor supplier. They're a huge business, and they're just selling commoditized products in standard volumes. And really, for them, you know, probably exports to the EU are making up quite a minimal amount of their overall business. I mean, if you look at steel in China, somewhere between 10 and 20% of it actually gets sold to the EU. The vast majority actually goes internally or to other markets. For them, it's not really in their interest to, from a business perspective, to be giving this data out. And so what you really end up with is that you've got this very scattered supply chain that it can be quite hard to get data through. So what do we actually see as kind of the big challenges in getting data? And I will go on in a minute to sort of talk about some of the solutions here. But if we look at the immediate suppliers who are exporting to the EU, typically they are a business that's working on price arbitrage, right? So they are buying products cheaply in China and exporting them at a markup to the EU. For them, they don't have a lot of knowledge on production processes. They may have very limited record keeping capability. A lot of the time, they don't know really where the products they've sold are coming from. They don't have supply chain visibility. Often, they're also not carbon literate, right? So if you send them the standard EU kind of CBAM questionnaire, they're not going to know a lot of the data that's in there, and they're not going to know how to start with that. For the installation or the precursor supplier, often they are kind of supplying to many traders at very, very low margins. They've got very limited incentive to go the extra mile unless this is really business critical for them. They actually often don't have visibility on their own energy usage at kind of the component or the product level. And again, they're typically not very carbon literate. This is not a topic that they really know a lot about. They won't know how to do the calculations for this quite often. And then finally, the state-owned companies, right? They're huge businesses. This is not material for them to be sort of responding to individual companies on request for carbon data. A lot of the time, they're selling mostly within China. They're selling, for example, large infrastructure projects. CBAM is not business critical to them. And a lot of them also don't have carbon data on a product level either. So it's something where we see that really there's a lot of challenges at all levels of being able to get this. So the question is really, what are the implications for EU importers, right? I think this is the most important thing. First of all, sending out the EU data collection template is not enough. I see this so often that I work with EU-based companies who will send out the EU's main kind of CBAM data collection template to their suppliers, and they're really shocked when they don't get anything back or they get really bad quality data. They haven't spent the time to sort of understand what data is available to my suppliers. They just sort of assume that everything is there. You need to spend effort on training your suppliers as well. If this is something that is material to you, it needs to be treated as any other sort of supplier engagement topic. If for example, human rights due diligence in your supply chain is important, you'll spend your time training your suppliers on human rights due diligence. Carbon is no different, right? This should be treated as any other sustainability or compliance topic within your supply chain. You need to train your suppliers and upskill them on what's going on. And finally, kind of some educated assumptions will always be needed, right? You may not be able to get all of this data. As a kind of an importer, really, there are two things that you need to care about. The first is making sure that you get high enough data quality that you can really show to the EU that you are going to the required level on gathering data here, and you don't leave yourself up for sort of a non-compliance penalty. But the other thing is making sure that you have accurate enough data that you're not overpaying by using the default values, right? So you really need to make sure that any assumptions you make are really helping you with those two objectives. So the question is then at this stage, right? I'll answer some of the specific questions in the chat as we go on to the next stage, but it's probably impossible to get 100% perfect data at this stage. How do we still maximize the quality of the data we are getting from our suppliers? So maybe at this stage, I'll just jump into the chat because I see a few questions here. So there's a question, Marcel, for you on, you mentioned searching through factories on your platform. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, if you have CBAM data, you can add it to our platform, and the data is yours. Nobody can look into it until you approve someone's request, and then you can share your emission data. It's a very easy way as let's say a Chinese or Indian or Turkish supplier to get new clients, because you can imagine, as Sol mentioned, by 2026 it becomes more and more important to have accurate CBAM data. If you have nothing, then it will be much more costlier for your importer. And we are often on trade shows. We see a lot of Chinese factories. They're the salesmen, and they are usually not that interested in CBAM until I tell them like, hey, look, if you want to get clients, if you want to get leads, just add your company to Dubrink. It's at dubrink.com/register. You can manually import your CBAM data. Factories can find you there, and they can contact you and place an order with you. Actually, that's how simple it is. Yeah, and in the platform you can do more than that. I will not go into that now, but that's how they do it. The second question is who is doing the due diligence on the fit? Well, that's actually what Sol just mentioned. But Sam, that's your side. Maybe you can elaborate more on that.
Sure. Hey Olivier, it's good to have you on the webinar. It's been a while since we talked. Yeah. So look, maybe I'll start with your first question, the cost difference. So I think the cost difference really depends, right, on exactly what the product is that you're importing. And it also depends on your specific factories, right? There's no real way to understand what the cost difference will be, for example, between default values and your own production process until you understand your own production process. You may have also different suppliers who are using different ways of getting energy into their processes that are also going to mean the emissions from two similar looking processes can be quite different. I think if you look, for example, at a factory located in, for example, a province where there's a high portion of solar energy, probably a lot of their grid energy is going to be quite clean already. They may have access to solar. If you look actually at another province, maybe the energy is coming from a coal-fired plant. There can be some differences there actually in the energy usage and the emissions coming from that. And the due diligence on the figures declared by the factory, well, I think that again is one of the major challenges, right? There is going to be verification needed on CBAM. What we see at the moment is that there's very little restriction around how to do diligence on whether these numbers are good or not. I mean, that's something that, to be honest, the verification at the moment, really the kind of auditing that's required is to show that you have a good process in doing your calculation. But the actual factory data, that's something that I think as an importer, you need to take the responsibility on making sure that data is good, because again, it's going to affect your supply. So it's going to affect the price you pay actually for the CBAM certificates. So I think typically the advice we give is that, even though nobody is sort of asking for a due diligence at the moment down to the level of individual suppliers, ultimately the benefit you get out of that is that you can be confident that what you're paying is actually what you're supposed to pay. So that's actually something that Reset spends a lot of time on, for example, is working with individual suppliers to double check their data. Yeah, and then I think there was another. Yeah, so Saul just adding some more information on the calculation point. Yeah. Okay. So look, maybe let's move on, because I think we can talk about actually that data collection and diligence topic a little bit more. It's an interesting one and pretty relevant, right? So how do we collect CBAM data at higher quality while minimizing workload? I think that's really the key here. We want to make sure that we're getting quality data, but we're not we're not going too far. So basically, there's kind of 3 points that I'd bring as kind of the most important here from our experience of working with suppliers. And by the way, this is not just on CBAM. This is true of just about every supplier engagement project we've done for 15 years, right? These 3 rules really apply. The first is make sure you're applying, you're addressing your most critical suppliers first. A lot of the time, what we see is that companies will try and go to the same level of effort with a supplier that's supplying 1% of your yearly purchase as your key critical suppliers who are supplying the majority. That's just not good from a time usage point of view and a time allocation point of view. Particularly with carbon, the reason that companies often do that is they're not really clear on actually who is contributing the most to their emissions in the first place. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can make some assumptions there to actually make that estimation a bit easier. Second thing is simplify the data collection template, right? So make sure that it's really understand what information your suppliers actually have, and then ask them for that and do the calculation on the back end, right? It's no point sort of asking suppliers for perfect carbon data when they maybe actually don't even know their energy costs, It's better to make assumptions, or sorry, not make assumptions, but sort of ask your customers for what they already have, and then you can do the calculations from there. The final thing is really provide training and support during the data collection process. So let's actually look. This is Reset's approach with a large German retailer. So I've anonymized this. I've also sort of put I've kind of screened out the CN codes that they were using, but basically this retailer has about 81 different HS codes that are subject to CBAM reporting requirements within their product portfolio. We collected various data according to each HS code, and what we were able to do is actually understand the volume of the different products that they were importing in each HS code. Now, we saw that mostly they were importing things, for example, under I've called it here the AAHS code just because I'm anonymizing this for the client. Most of it came under this. Actually, what we also realized is that most of these products came from the same supplier. So really critically, what we said is we need to spend our time with this supplier. You're importing most of this HS code from the same supplier. We need to spend our time here. What we also saw is the majority of their emissions are coming from iron and steel. Aluminium made up very, very little. So what we really focused our process on was understanding who are the key iron and steel suppliers within that value chain and making sure we really started there. Now, what we actually were able to do with this is divide up their suppliers. And what we realized was once we looked into this list, we then got the volumes per product. So we got, literally got sort of the weight data for each of these products. We knew that these were made of iron or steel. Actually, all of them were made out of quite simple carbon steel or stainless steel. And so what we were able to do is just sort of take a very sort of basic emissions factor for steel produced in China. And based on the fact that we had the weight of the products, we could roughly understand which products were making up the bulk of their emissions. Now, what we found is that out of this supplier segmentation, we found that about 10 suppliers were covering 50% of their CBAM-related product emissions. Right? So they've got 81 different suppliers that are included in here, and out of those, actually, sorry, this is more than 81 HS codes, more than that when it comes to suppliers. But what we basically found is that 67 of these suppliers were almost totally irrelevant. You didn't need to get data from them. They were 67 suppliers providing 20% of the emissions. We then looked at sort of the top 50% was 10 suppliers and the top 30% was 17. Basically, what we know is that we can spend our time here. Right? These top 10 are the ones that are really going to move the needle. This is where it's important for us to get real data. Right? A couple of reasons for that. First of all, these are your suppliers where you're most likely to actually get somebody looking at your calculation process because you've got a lot of your emissions coming from these suppliers. But secondly, these are the ones where you can make interventions, right? And if you actually make some kind of intervention to help them decarbonize, help you to reduce your certificate costs, it's likely to move the needle if you do it with any of these suppliers. The others, what we also found is that their relationships with these suppliers were not that strong. They typically were, buying from some of these suppliers fairly irregularly. It was going to be very difficult for them to actually get these suppliers to agree to give the data because they don't know them so well. These 10 suppliers were very strategic. They've got good relationships. And so for them, it was very easy to actually start to get the CBAM data. So the first thing is this kind of segmentation activity is absolutely essential because otherwise what you'll do is spend all of your time with these suppliers who are not actually that important to you and probably need way more support than your top 10. Second thing we did was we basically identified 2 pathways for these suppliers to train them up and to gather the data. So for the first group of suppliers, which is this top 10, we basically developed a specific CBAM data collection template for each of these suppliers based on the knowledge we had of actually what data they had available. So we did some interviews with each of those suppliers. We kind of did a pre-read material that they could kind of go through and say, okay, what data can I get? And then we developed this data collection template from them. We also got them to give us some details about their own tier 2 suppliers. So this is where the precursor materials are coming from. And then what we did was go to them physically. So we actually got, they were all located in the Guangdong area. So we were able to organize a meeting with all of them and get them all to one place to be trained up. And what we found was really, really useful here is that the suppliers kind of trained each other. So we did a one-day workshop on this. We got all of the suppliers in a room together, and all of them shared actually on the challenges they have with getting CBAM data. It wasn't the first time for any of them. A lot of them, though, were being asked this by a lot of their different customers, but they hadn't really been able to share with anybody what their challenges were. So we got them all in a room together, did a big training with everybody, and by the end of that, what we were able to really understand is that all of them could learn from each other, and it was really, really useful as an exercise. But of course, that works much better when you're focusing on the top 10 rather than doing this with hundreds, right? Then we sent them away with a data collection template. They'd been trained on how to fill that in during the training process. And then actually as reset, all we had to do was sort of review their submission. But because we knew that actually they'd been trained, we knew that they had all of the data available, they were able to give us really high quality data. And we knew that most of this was pretty good. For the second group, so this is the 17 suppliers who are kind of not as carbon intensive, we were able to do something quite similar, except we did it online. So rather than bringing them all physically, we engaged them with a couple of online group trainings. Again, they were able to sort of chat to each other. They could also have a chat community afterwards that they could ask any questions in. But doing it online just kept it a bit lighter touch. This one was a whole day. This we did over a couple of hours. And then also offered sort of a help desk support where they could call the client or call their customer if they had any questions, and then they could refer those questions back to us, and we were able to sort of help them to answer those one by one. So again, this is something where the quality didn't need to be quite so good because these suppliers are not quite as emissions intensive, but at least we could make sure that they were able to give us 80% of the data at quite good quality. And then basically, for the others, we can just use the default values. They're in this last 20%. It's not something that's super critical. And so here we can just apply the default values. And we're confident that because it's this last 20%, even if the default values are a bit of an overestimate, for this group, it's not going to matter so much because they're not producing that many emissions. We then worked on data collection, right? And I just want to sort of give an insight here into what our data collection template looked like. I know Marcel's going to talk a lot more about the Dubrink data collection process in a minute, but basically here, it's much simpler than the EU data collection template. So really, a lot of this is sort of yes/no answers. We talk about what kind of energy source are they using, and then what we'll ask them to do is really, to kind of give billing data for that energy source, right? We don't make it sort of super detailed that they've got to give specific emissions data. The fact that we actually sort of eliminate a lot of the energy sources that they're not using also just reduces the complexity. And then anything that's kind of here that they need to fill in is highlighted in green, and they know exactly what they've got to fill in. So basically, the idea is that we just make this very, very easy for them. We just ask sort of for product volume data as well, and just things that we know that they're going to have. And then actually on the back end, then we can go and fill in the EU sheet. I mean, I don't want to go into sort of the details of this, but you can see that, this data collection template versus this one, even just visually to the supplier, this looks far, far simpler. So the idea is to just give them something very simple that they know how to fill in. Obviously, all of this also is translated into local language depending on where the supplier is. I don't see any more questions in the chat at this stage. So maybe, Marcel, let me pass over to you quickly to give an insight onto how Dubrink works on this data collection topic.
Yeah, let's go for the next slide, if that's okay for you. Yeah, I'm gonna keep it short, but Dubrink is a CBAM platform that actually automates CBAM end to end. So where we see that all these communication templates need to be sent down the supply chain. In China, if we go to the next slide, you will be able to see that we automate it all in one go. The importers can get your emission data, of course, only if you give permission to show your emission data to them, and they can use it. And on the side of the importers, they can very easily report the data into the EU portal. Very soon, we're going to also include analytics, which makes it much easier for importers to steer their CBAM. And joining our platform as a supplier is free of charge. Actually, I believe it will bring you additional clients because more and more companies are looking into the platform. to look for companies which are CBAM compliant. If you're currently not CBAM compliant yet, but you are planning to do so, you can, for now, for example, enter the default values, and later you can adapt them into the actual values. And let's go to the next slide. How we do that is actually pretty easy. The importers are putting their data into our platform. Automatically, the data is sent to the suppliers, connected with the emissions into the supplier section. So you as a supplier would have a supplier section. You as an importer, you would have an importer section. If you're a consultant, you can, if the companies allow you to hover from importer to supplier and to several accounts and help and support those companies. And on the supplier side, you can also calculate your emissions. So the data, what Sam is helping you to extract, you enter it into a platform. Per process, you can calculate your CBAM data. And from there on, it's literally a matter of a click to provide your CBAM data to all the importers in the EU. So we have factories who work together with, for example, Restart Carbon. They have their data, they enter it in the platform, they connect their importers to it. And from there on, CBAM takes them literally a matter of minutes. And on the importer side, the good thing is that when they are connecting the emission data with the imports, they can summarize it in one file. It's a zip file, in which is an XML file that they upload to the EU portal, and their reporting is done. And that saves a lot of time, complexity, and especially you can receive reports, audit trails. So if in 4 years you get an inspection on your emissions, and maybe that colleague who is responsible for CBAM already 3 or 4 times changed position, and there's a new person who is not able to find which Excel file or which document or which certificate you need to get together to eventually compile the emissions of that certain import, then you just go into the Dubrink platform. You get your report, you hand it over to the audit committee, and you're done. Yeah, we can just go to the next one. This is what I just actually mentioned, and that is actually all I wanted to mention about Dubrink. If you're of interest in our platform as a supplier, go to portal.dubrink.com/register and sign up. If you're an importer and you want to work with Dubrink and automate it, go to our website and feel free to book a demo with us. Thank you, Sam. You're still on mute, Sam.
Apologies, thank you. Maybe I'll start with the elephant in the room, or finish off by looking ahead. How is Omnibus going to change things? Now, what everybody has been talking about in the CBAM world over the past probably 3 or 4 months at this stage is the EU has softened the regulation slightly. Now, what I'd like to sort of talk about now is does this change anything that I've just said about getting supplier data? And the answer really is a resounding no. Right now, I won't go through everything on this slide just because this will be sent out afterwards. But if we actually look at what the changes are within the Omnibus package, the first is really there's an exemption for small importers. Now, there's no reporting for companies who are importing under 50 tons per year at this stage. This will be adapted year on year, depending on how many companies are actually reporting data. Emissions calculation, there's not a lot of change, right? There's the exclusion of non-calcinated clays from the CBAM scope, which was one of the sort of concrete or cement sub categories. But particularly for companies importing from Asia to China or to Europe, this was not a big category anyway. There's going to be an extended deadline for submitting annual CBAM declarations. Obviously, the active period is not going to now apply until 2027. But I think from what we've just seen, there's still a lot of complexity around getting your data in the first place. So even if it's 2027, if you haven't started, you need to start because you've got a lot of data. You're going to need to get your suppliers used to this. There's no time like the present, right? And what you will be able to do if you have good quality data now, when the active period enters into force and you need to start paying for CBAM certificates, you can also calculate what those are going to cost you. And it means that it's not going to hit you by surprise. It's not something that's going to sort of shock you. And it's something you can start preparing up front for, particularly now as we enter into a world where there are going to be a lot more export and import controls and tariffs coming in, as we've seen in the past in the past couple of days. So for us, really, We don't see any difference here in what you need to do on your supplier level. Yes, there's a little bit more time to do it, but I would see that now as an opportunity to get ready, not as an opportunity to delay, because the complexity doesn't change. Okay. Good. So I think we've got a few more minutes just for a few last questions. If there's any questions you have or any support or requests you'd like to talk through offline, please feel free to reach out to either of us. Otherwise, I think we can just check if there's any further questions in the chat.
Sam, may I add something to the previous slide?
Yeah, sure.
If just one with so this 50 tons, everybody thinks it's fixed, but that's actually not the case. The 50 ton is actually based on the fact that 99% of the emissions are now still within the scope of CBAM, meaning that if the amount of emissions will change in the future, also the threshold will change. That means it can go up, but if less companies are importing emissions, most likely it will go down. Another thing what I want to mention, what I see is very tricky, is that the EU now postponed the moment when you have to buy your CBAM certificates to 2027. That actually means that this, let's say the CFO or the bank account will only start to get hurt by paying CBAM certificates in 2027. So companies, I mean, if you're, for example, a factory, you might want to inform your importers. And if you're an importer, you might want to be aware of this, that even though 2026 is counting, the bill will come. And personally, I think it would have been much easier if you would have to buy in 2026 in Q1 your certificates, because a lot of companies would get a wake-up call, but that wake-up call is now pretty much delayed, and it's really important to keep that into account. Because once it's 2027 and you have to work with default values because you do not have your actual values, yeah, then you're gonna get penalized, and yeah, I think that can be a significant hit for quite some companies.
Especially given the fact that the EU carbon price is likely to go up and up in the coming years as the caps reduce. So yeah, a delayed hit, but a bigger hit. Yeah, good. So I think we've got one more question. You know, is the supply chain in China, does this still count for exporters and operators in non-EU countries? I would say, I mean, Marcel, you've already said yes in there. Absolutely, yes, this still applies. In a lot of ways, Chinese supply chains are actually fairly mature on a lot of this stuff. There are suppliers, particularly if you're working, for example, in Southeast Asia, where you'll see that actually their ability to get data is even lower. You know, also if you look sort of in kind of India, Bangladesh, often the processes are far more carbon intensive as well, particularly if we look at something like steel or aluminium. So yes, absolutely, this still applies. The segmentation principle is absolutely the one I would recommend every company to use. Focus on your top suppliers and get really, really good data from them, because then that's going to allow you to you know, to make sure that you tackle the majority of your emissions. Okay. Good. So look, with that, I think we're hitting time. I don't see any further questions in the chat. I'd like to say thank you to everybody for joining the session today. As mentioned, it's going to be recorded, and that will be sent out in the next couple of days after the session. We'll share the slides as well. But until then, thank you everybody for coming. Thanks to the Dubrink team, and wish everyone.
Thank you, Sam. It was a pleasure.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day all.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
sir. Bye-bye.